The tradition she questioned was an ancient one, rooted in the belief that deviation invited disaster.
It governed succession, inheritance, and the perceived favor of the heavens. Officials defended it not with reason, but with precedent. It had always been done this way, therefore it must continue. The Empress's inquiry was measured. According to later accounts preserved in secondary chronicles, she asked whether the custom still served the empire, or whether it merely preserved fear. She raised concerns about its impact on stability, on loyalty within the court, and on the moral authority of the throne. These were not emotional appeals, they were administrative questions. But in systems built on absolute tradition, questions are threats. Her words were reported upward, filtered through layers of officials whose power depended on maintaining established order.
Each retelling sharpened the perceived danger. What began as inquiry was reframed as dissent. Dissent, in turn, was framed as destabilization. And destabilization within this belief system justified extreme response. From this point, the Empress's presence in official records begins to fade. Public appearances ceased. Her name was omitted from ceremonial inscriptions. Attendants were reassigned. The court continued its routines, projecting calm while isolating the woman who had disrupted it. Isolation was one of the most effective tools of control. Removed from allies, stripped of influence, the Empress existed in a state of suspended authority. She was neither openly condemned nor defended.
This ambiguity allowed the system to operate without scrutiny. No single decree needed to be issued. No public explanation required. Within the palace, rumors spread carefully. Servants spoke in fragments. Officials avoided discussion. Everyone understood that the matter had moved beyond debate. Tradition was asserting itself. At this stage, the Empress was no longer an individual in the eyes of the court. She had become a problem to be resolved quietly. Her past loyalty, her status, even her role in maintaining the empire's image were outweighed by the perceived risk of allowing doubt to exist at the center of power. This is how institutional oppression functions at its most refined. It does not require spectacle.
It relies on procedure, silence, and the shared understanding that compliance ensures survival. Historical distance allows us to recognize the psychological toll of such confinement. Accounts suggest the Empress was given no opportunity to defend her intentions. There was no forum for explanation. In a system that equated tradition with legitimacy, explanation was irrelevant. The outcome was determined the moment the question was asked. The method chosen to resolve the matter was consistent with the values of the time. Punishment needed to be absolute, yet discreet. It needed to remove the individual while preserving the appearance of harmony. It needed to reinforce fear without creating a martyr.
What followed was recorded only indirectly. Later scholars would piece together references to a sealed decision and a closed ritual, language carefully chosen to obscure responsibility while acknowledging finality. The Empress's end was framed not as execution, but as correction, not as violence, but as necessity. For those who lived within the palace walls, the message was unmistakable. Tradition was not open to review. Even at the highest level, obedience was enforced. The silence that followed her disappearance was deliberate. Silence, after all, is one of the most powerful tools of erasure. The broader population never heard her name again. No official mourning was declared, no explanation offered.
History moved forward, as it often does, without acknowledging the cost paid by those who questioned its direction. Yet traces remained, in marginal notes, in altered rituals, in the cautious behavior of future empresses who learned from what was not said. Fear became embedded in protocol. Questions were avoided. Tradition hardened.
The Empress's story survived not because it was recorded faithfully, but because it disturbed those who inherited the system she challenged. It lingered as a warning passed quietly among women of the court, a reminder that power did not protect against punishment when that power was conditional. As we continue this investigation, we will examine how this moment fit into a larger pattern of control, how the aftermath reshaped imperial behavior, and how history itself participated in her disappearance.
If you are ready to continue uncovering how questioning tradition became a crime punishable by erasure, say the word. After the Empress vanished from public life, the court did not pause. Ceremonies continued. Decrees were issued. The empire projected stability with practiced confidence. This was not indifference, it was design. Systems built on tradition depend on continuity. Any visible disruption would suggest vulnerability, and vulnerability, in this political culture, invited unrest. Inside the palace, however, behavior shifted in subtle ways. Officials spoke more carefully. Rituals were followed with heightened precision. The absence of the Empress created a vacuum filled not with sympathy, but with caution.
Those who had overheard her question, even indirectly, understood that curiosity itself had become dangerous. The emperor never addressed her fate publicly. Silence from the throne was itself an answer. In hierarchical societies, what is not said often carries more weight than what is declared. By refusing to explain, the ruler affirmed the authority of tradition without exposing the mechanisms that enforced it. This moment marked a turning point in the internal culture of the court. Advisors who once debated interpretation now recited precedent. Scholars avoided commentary that could be construed as reformist. The purpose of governance narrowed. It was no longer to improve the system, but to preserve it unchanged.
For women within the palace, the lesson was unmistakable. Rank offered visibility, not safety. Proximity to power increased risk rather than reducing it. The Empress had been the most protected woman in the empire, and yet she had been removed without resistance. That knowledge reshaped behavior more effectively than any written law. Historical records from this period reveal an increase in formalized conduct codes for imperial women. These documents emphasized restraint, silence, and ritual conformity. While framed as moral guidance, they functioned as safeguards for the institution. The message was clear: personal judgment was incompatible with survival. What makes this case particularly revealing is the absence of overt brutality in its documentation.
There are no descriptions of confrontation, no accounts of raised voices. The machinery of punishment operated quietly, almost administratively. This was not an act of rage, it was an act of policy. The tradition the Empress questioned continued, but it did not emerge unchanged. Over time, it became more rigid, less open to interpretation. Scholars later noted that reforms slowed dramatically after her disappearance. Innovation was replaced by replication. Stability was achieved at the cost of adaptability. This outcome illustrates a recurring pattern in history. When systems respond to inquiry with elimination, they discourage not only dissent, but competence. The empire preserved its customs, but weakened its capacity to evolve.
Fear became embedded in governance. The Empress herself was not remembered as a rebel. In fact, her name was rarely mentioned at all. Erasure was more effective than condemnation. Without a narrative, there could be no debate. Without debate, tradition appeared uncontested. Yet memory has a way of surviving outside official channels. Fragments of her story appear in later writings, often indirect and cautious. A court historian references a consort removed for imbalance. A regional scholar alludes to a correction enacted within the palace to preserve harmony. These phrases obscure more than they reveal,
but they acknowledge that something occurred. More revealing are the silences, her absence from ancestral lists.
The abrupt change in ceremonial language, the reassignment of attendants who had served her, these omissions speak to a deliberate effort to close the record. The psychological impact of this erasure extended beyond the palace. Families connected to the Empress retreated from prominence. Marriage alliances were reconsidered. Nobility learned that proximity to reform carried consequences. Over time, loyalty became synonymous with compliance. It is important to understand that this was not an anomaly. The Empress's fate fits within a broader structure that prioritized continuity over conscience. In such systems, tradition is not a shared inheritance, but a tool of control. It defines acceptable thought.
It punishes deviation, and it does so while claiming moral authority. This is why her story matters, not because it is unique, but because it is representative. As we examine similar cases across history, a pattern emerges. Women who questioned ritual, law, or custom were often framed as destabilizing forces. Their concerns were reframed as emotional, irrational, or dangerous. The response was rarely public debate. More often, it was containment. Containment took many forms: isolation, disappearance, reassignment. In this case, it took the form of a punishment designed to leave no spectacle and no legacy. The goal was not to inspire fear through visibility, but to normalize obedience through absence.
Midway through this account, it is worth reflecting on why such stories remain difficult to trace. They challenge the narratives institutions prefer to preserve. They reveal that tradition, when unexamined, can become a mechanism for harm, and they remind us that history often records the outcomes of power, not the experiences of those subjected to it. This is why continuing this investigation matters. By examining how systems respond to questioning, we begin to understand how silence is manufactured, and by understanding that process, we resist its repetition. This is the shared purpose behind dark inquest history and those who follow these stories, not as spectators, but as witnesses across time.
In the years following the Empress's disappearance, the empire maintained outward stability. There were no immediate rebellions attributed to her fate. This fact was later used to justify the decision. Stability, after all, had been preserved. But stability achieved through fear carries hidden costs. Administrative correspondence from later decades reveals increasing reliance on coercive enforcement of custom. Officials reported compliance, but also apathy. Innovation declined. Provincial leaders followed orders, but rarely offered insight. The system functioned, but it no longer listened. This decline was gradual, and therefore invisible to those within it. Tradition, once a living framework, became static.
It no longer adapted to new circumstances. When challenges eventually arose, from economic strain to external pressure, the empire struggled to respond creatively. Some historians argue that this rigidity contributed to later crises. While it would be inaccurate to attribute long-term decline to a single event, the Empress's story illustrates how moments of suppression accumulate. Each silenced voice narrows the range of possible futures. Culturally, the treatment of imperial women hardened. Later empresses were chosen for their predictability rather than their intellect. Education shifted toward rote memorization of ritual rather than interpretation. The role became increasingly symbolic. And yet, beneath this surface, quiet resistance persisted.
Not in the form of open questioning, but in private reflection. Letters never sent, thoughts never spoken. The Empress's fate became a reference point, an unspoken boundary marking how far one could go. Her story survived in these margins, in cautionary whispers,
in altered behavior, in the very rigidity that followed her absence. As we move toward the final phases of this investigation, we will confront the darkest implications of her punishment, the symbolic meaning of her removal, and the long shadow it cast over historical memory. By the time a new empress was installed, the court had already absorbed the lesson. Selection criteria shifted quietly but decisively. Candidates were evaluated less for judgment or insight and more for predictability.
Advisors spoke of balance and harmony, but what they sought was compliance. The position was redesigned to minimize risk, not to enhance governance. This recalibration did not occur through law alone. It happened through atmosphere, through the way attendants lowered their voices, through the way scholars quoted texts without commentary, through the way questions were redirected or left unanswered. Fear did not need to announce itself. It settled into routine. The memory of the former empress was managed carefully. There were no statues to dismantle, no inscriptions to chisel away. She had already been excluded from most official representations during her final months. What remained were administrative gaps, unexplained transitions, abrupt reassignments, ceremonies that referenced a role without naming the person who once occupied it.
Such absences are not accidental. They are the fingerprints of intentional forgetting. In later generations, chroniclers attempting to reconcile records encountered inconsistencies. Timelines did not align. Titles appeared briefly, then vanished. Some copied earlier texts without noticing omissions. Others noticed, but chose not to comment. To write openly about such a case was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny had consequences. This is how institutional memory is shaped, not by what is recorded, but by what is allowed to be recorded. The punishment itself was never described in detail, and that restraint was deliberate. Language used by the court framed the event as a correction of imbalance, a restoration of order.
There was no acknowledgement of suffering, only of outcome. The Empress was not portrayed as a victim, but as a disruption resolved. What mattered was not what happened to her, but what her removal symbolized. It reaffirmed the hierarchy. It reinforced the idea that tradition stood above individuals, even those crowned by it. And it demonstrated that loyalty was measured not by service, but by silence. The symbolic weight of her fate extended beyond the palace walls. Provincial administrators, many of whom never knew her name, absorbed the message indirectly. They learned that questioning precedent was unsafe, that reform, even when framed as concern for stability, could be interpreted as threat.
As a result, governance became more rigid at every level. This rigidity affected not only women, but all marginalized voices within the empire. Lower officials avoided proposing changes. Scholars limited their research to accepted interpretations. The empire's intellectual life narrowed, constrained by an invisible boundary established by fear. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to view this as a failure of courage, but such judgments overlook the reality of living under absolute systems. Survival often depends on adaptation, not resistance. The court's response was not moral approval, but pragmatic compliance. For women of the imperial household, the implications were particularly severe.
Their roles were already defined by restriction. After the Empress's disappearance, those restrictions hardened into doctrine. Conduct manuals emphasized emotional restraint. Instruction focused on obedience as virtue. The space for influence shrank. Yet within these constraints, the memory of the Empress persisted as a quiet undercurrent, not as a heroic legend, but as a cautionary presence. She became a reference without a name, a lesson without a story. Her fate was understood, even if it was never spoken aloud. This kind of memory is difficult to trace, but it is powerful. It shapes behavior across generations.
It influences decisions without appearing in records. It survives through implication rather than narrative.
The Empress's questioning of tradition did not disappear entirely. Elements of her concern resurfaced later, reframed and diluted. Minor adjustments were made decades afterward, attributed to circumstance rather than reflection. In this way, her ideas outlived her, stripped of authorship. This too is a form of erasure. When contributions are absorbed without acknowledgement, the individual behind them vanishes from history. The system evolves just enough to survive, while denying credit to those who prompted change. The moral complexity of this outcome is unsettling. The empire avoided immediate instability. It maintained order, but it did so by sacrificing transparency and suppressing conscience.
The cost was paid quietly by individuals whose names were removed from the record. As historians examined this period, debates continue about the extent of the Empress's influence. Some argue that her role has been exaggerated by later interpretation. Others suggest that the scarcity of evidence is itself proof of deliberate suppression. What remains undisputed is that her disappearance coincided with a marked shift toward rigidity. This shift did not reverse quickly. Even when external pressures forced adaptation, internal culture resisted introspection. Tradition had become armor. It protected the system from critique, but also from growth. The Empress's story invites a broader question.
What happens to societies that treat inquiry as disobedience? History offers many answers, and few are encouraging. Systems that cannot examine themselves tend to fracture under pressure. When flexibility is punished, resilience declines. This is not a lesson confined to one empire or era. It repeats across cultures and centuries. Authority that equates tradition with legitimacy often confuses continuity with justice. In doing so, it places preservation above humanity. The Empress did not challenge tradition to overthrow the system. By all available accounts, she sought clarification, perhaps even improvement. That distinction did not matter. In absolute frameworks, intent is secondary to impact.
And the impact of her question was uncertainty. Uncertainty is intolerable to systems built on ritual certainty. It opens space for debate. Debate invites comparison. Comparison threatens hierarchy. And so the system responded as it was designed to respond, efficiently, quietly, permanently. As we approach the final stage of this account, we must consider not only what was done to the Empress, but what was done to history itself. Her burial was not only physical. It was archival, linguistic, cultural, a comprehensive effort to ensure that the question she asked would not be asked again. Yet here we are, centuries later, still confronting the shadow of that question. Not because it was answered, but because it was silenced.
In the final part of this documentary, we will examine how her story survived despite suppression, how later generations interpreted her fate, and what her erasure reveals about the relationship between power and memory. Long after the palace gates closed and the court moved on, the Empress's story survived in fragile ways. It did not endure through monuments or official chronicles. It persisted through hesitation, through altered behavior, through the careful way later rulers avoided certain questions. History often preserves power openly, but it preserves fear indirectly. In later centuries, scholars encountering gaps in imperial records debated their meaning. Some dismissed them as clerical loss.
Others suggested political motives. A few, writing cautiously, hinted that absence itself could be evidence, that something significant had been removed, not by accident, but by intention. These scholars understood the risk of such interpretation. To accuse an institution of deliberate erasure was to challenge the very authority that safeguarded historical truth. And yet, the pattern was difficult to ignore. The Empress appeared briefly at the height of ceremonial life, then vanished without explanation. No illness recorded, no transfer of title, no mourning rites, only continuity, uninterrupted and unquestioned. Cultural memory absorbed this silence. Later generations spoke of ideal empresses as those who were unseen yet present, influential only through obedience.
The role became less about guidance and more about symbolic reassurance. Stability mattered more than insight. Ritual outweighed reason. In this way, the Empress's fate shaped not only her era, but those that followed. Her questioning of tradition became a boundary marker, defining how far authority could be examined from within. That boundary was enforced not through repeated punishment, but through remembered fear. This is how power sustains itself over time, not solely through force, but through internalized limits. When individuals learn to censor their own thoughts, systems no longer need to intervene visibly. Control becomes efficient, normalized, and nearly invisible. The long-term consequences of this approach are complex.
On the surface, the empire endured. It maintained its ceremonies, its hierarchies, its appearance of order. But beneath that surface, adaptability diminished. When challenges emerged that tradition could not address, responses were slow and rigid. Innovation had been trained out of governance. Some historians argue that this rigidity contributed to later instability, not directly, but cumulatively. Each suppressed voice reduced the system's ability to self-correct. Each erased individual narrowed the range of acceptable solutions. Over time, tradition became less a guide and more a constraint. The Empress's personal beliefs are largely unknown to us. That too is a result of erasure. We cannot say how far she intended to go, or what reforms she imagined.
What we can say is that her inquiry exposed a vulnerability in the system, and rather than confront that vulnerability, the system eliminated the source. Her story reminds us that oppression does not always appear as chaos. Sometimes it appears as order maintained at any cost. Sometimes it wears the language of harmony while enforcing silence. Sometimes it operates most effectively when no one speaks of it at all. For women in particular, this pattern has repeated across history. Their proximity to power has often increased scrutiny rather than agency. Their mistakes are treated as moral failures, their questions as threats, and their removal as necessary corrections rather than injustices.
The Empress who questioned tradition paid for that question not because it was reckless, but because it was rational. Rational inquiry undermines systems that rely on unquestioned belief. And in such systems, belief must be protected at all costs. Yet history is not entirely obedient. Even when records are altered, memory finds alternative paths. It survives through implication, through cautionary examples, through the way future generations adjust behavior in response to what they are not told. The survival of this story, fragmented and incomplete, is itself an act of resistance. It demonstrates that erasure is never total, that silence can be examined, that absence can be interrogated. This is why stories like this matter today.
Not to assign blame across centuries, but to understand how power operates when it feels threatened, to recognize the signs of systems that prioritize preservation over people, and to remember those who were removed not for rebellion, but for reflection. The Empress was buried not only beneath stone and ceremony, but beneath narrative control. Her legacy was not a monument, but a warning encoded into institutional behavior, a reminder that tradition, when shielded from scrutiny, can become a tool of harm. Her final legacy is not found in what she was allowed to say, but in what others learned not to say afterward. History often presents us with conquerors, lawmakers, and victors.
But just as important are those whose stories were intentionally shortened, whose questions were treated as crimes, and whose silence was engineered to protect authority.
The Empress who questioned tradition stands among them, not as a symbol of defiance, but as evidence of how fragile power can be when examined honestly. And perhaps the most haunting truth of her story is this: she did not disappear because she lacked power. She disappeared because she revealed how power truly worked. To remember her is not to romanticize her fate, but to acknowledge the cost of unquestioned systems, and to understand that preserving memory is itself a form of accountability. If stories like this matter to you, if examining what history tried to hide feels like a responsibility rather than entertainment, then continue this work with Dark Inquest History, not as an act of curiosity, but as a way of keeping erased voices from disappearing entirely. Her name may be lost, but her question endures.